Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a look at something you probably interact with all the time if you're a student or maybe involved in education somehow.
Yeah, something that seems, well, pretty straightforward on the surface.
Exactly. Until you start really looking closely, we're talking about assessment questions.
That's right. The
Yeah.
actual words, the phrasing used to measure what you know or what you understand or what skills you have, it sounds simple.
Uh-huh.
But getting it right, writing a truly good question, it's surprisingly complex.
And for this deep dive, we're basing this on a really fascinating expert report. It meticulously examined a whole bunch of assessment questions.
Right. They looked at their integrity from, well, several pretty crucial angles.
Kind of like putting these questions under a microscope.
Exactly. And our mission here is to understand what actually makes a question effective and fair and clear.
And why getting that wording just so isn't just like a minor detail, why it's absolutely fundamental.
Yeah, fundamental to good assessment. We want to explore how the experts analyze these things, what flaws they find, often really subtle ones, and what that tells us about the quality of assessment overall.
And crucially, why this matters to you listening. How the way a question is designed can genuinely impact your ability to just show what you know.
So let's start with the core idea from this report, because they're really clear on this.
Okay.
The quality of the individual questions themselves. That's the absolute bedrock, the foundation for any valid, reliable measurement.
That sounds, well, really strong. The absolute bedrock. Why is it that crucial? Can't you have a decent test even with a few weak questions?
Well, think about it. First off, well-crafted questions are like the main tool you have to accurately measure knowledge and skills.
Right.
If a question is perfectly clear, totally unambiguous, then you can show your understanding without, wrestling with confusing language first. Your actual knowledge gets to shine through.
Okay, so clear questions mean you're testing the subject, not the student's ability to decode the test itself.
Precisely. And that connects directly to this huge issue of fairness, equity.
Uh-huh.
Because ambiguity, or just poor phrasing, maybe some unintentional bias in the wording,
Yep.
that can really disadvantage certain students, unintentionally, of course.
How so?
Well, the assessment might suddenly become a test of, say, your language skills or your background knowledge that's not even related to the subject being tested.
Ah, okay.
So poorly designed questions, they can act as these hidden barriers. They mask someone's true understanding of the material.
I see. So, like, a question that's supposed to test your history knowledge might end up testing how well you can untangle a really awkwardly written sentence.
Exactly that. And that introduces something the report calls construct irrelevant variance.
Okay, that sounds a bit technical. Construct irrelevant variance. What's that in plain English?
It just means the test is measuring things other than the specific knowledge or skill it's supposed to measure.
Like what?
Like your ability to guess what the question writer was trying to say, or maybe your tolerance for confusing language, or just how good you are at navigating complex sentences.
Instead of your actual grasp of the topic.
Right, instead of the construct, the thing it's meant to measure. And that just completely undermines the whole point of the assessment, doesn't it?
Got it. So, good questions measure your knowledge. Bad questions might measure, well, how good you are at taking bad tests.
Pretty much, yeah. And beyond just, validity and fairness, clear questions actually give educators much better diagnostic info.
How?
They show where students are struggling with the content, not just if they struggled with the wording. And for you, as a student, clear questions just mean less frustration, less anxiety.
Makes sense.
When you understand what's being asked, you can actually focus on answering it, showing what you know. The whole thing feels less like an ordeal.
Okay, so if question quality is this critical foundation, how do these experts actually, evaluate them? The report mentioned a very systematic process.
Yeah, they use a really rigorous, structured method.
Mm-hmm.
Each question went through this detailed review based on specific predefined criteria, almost like a quality control checklist.
And the report highlights three main criteria they used, right? There was linguistic review, logical consistency review,
Yep,
and student addressability review.
that's correct. Every question got checked against those dimensions. And based on that check, each question got a status.
Like approve
Right, if it passed muster, or review if it needed work.
or reject.
Yeah, reject if it was just fundamentally flawed.
And they gave detailed reasons, recommendations for each one. That's where you really see the why, isn't it? Why something got flagged.
Exactly. So let's dig into these criteria now and look at some specific examples pulled right from the source material, because that makes it much clearer what kinds of flaws they were finding and why they actually matter.
Okay, sounds good. Let's start with linguistic review. Now, that sounds like just checking grammar and spelling, but I got the feeling from the report it's, well, more than simple proofreading.
Much more. I mean, sure, simple errors like typos or basic grammar mistakes get noted, because even a small typo can be distracting, right?
Yeah.
Or worse, it could actually cause misinterpretation. Think about homophones, or technical terms spelled slightly wrong.
True.
But the report really focuses on grammatical issues that genuinely mess with the meaning, or that just add extra cognitive load, make it harder to think about the actual content.
Okay, give me an example from the source. What kind of specific grammar problems were tripping questions up?
Well, a really common one, and quite problematic, was pronoun ambiguity.
Pronoun ambiguity.
Yeah. Imagine a sentence in a question like this. The process involves several stages. It is crucial for success.
Okay. Wait, what does it refer to there? The whole process? Or just the last stage you mentioned? Or maybe one specific stage?
Exactly. That's the problem the source points out. It forces you, the student, to just stop and guess. What did the writer intend it to mean?
Right.
And that guessing, it pulls your mental energy away from thinking about the process itself, the stages, their importance.
And puts it onto decoding the sentence structure.
Precisely. And that compromises validity because now you're being partly tested on linguistic interpretation, not just your knowledge of the process.
That makes total sense. It's like this little side puzzle you have to solve before you can even tackle the real question.
Another good example, still in the grammar world, that the report highlights, is dangling or misplaced modifiers. You know that classic kind of funny one, covered in mud, the farmer found his pig.
Yeah, where it sounds like the farmer was the one covered in mud.
Exactly. Now, in a test question, that's not funny. It's genuinely confusing. It creates immediate uncertainty about what's being described. What noun does covered in mud actually go with?
It makes the whole scenario unclear, forces you to make assumptions again.
Right. And there were other things, too, like faulty parallelism.
Multi-parallelism.
Yeah, like when items in a list don't match grammatically. You know, the aims are to analyze, interpreting, and summary. It just feels awkward and slightly confusing.
Okay.
Or just overly complex sentences. Lots of nested clauses making it really hard work just to unpack the sentence, even if every word is technically correct. These things aren't always flat-out wrong grammar, maybe, but they make the question way harder to process quickly and accurately.
Adding that extra mental work, the cognitive load you mentioned.
Exactly, that unwelcome cognitive load.
So linguistic review is really about making sure the words, the sentences themselves, are crystal clear and don't create these unintended hurdles. What about the next one? Logical consistency.
Okay, so this one's about whether the question actually makes internal sense. Is it coherent? Does it maybe contain hidden contradictions? Or does it rely on information that isn't provided or isn't, universally known by the students?
What kind of issues did the report flag under that heading?
Well, one common problem was unstated assumptions.
Unstated assumptions.
Yeah, the question might be built on some premise or some bit of context that isn't actually stated anywhere in the question or the provided materials.
But you needed to answer correctly.
Right. And if you don't happen to share that assumption or you just don't recognize it, you're kind of locked out. You can't really answer the question properly.
Like needing a secret password just to understand the question.
Sort of, yeah. Another big one is just plain vagueness or imprecision. The source used an example like, discuss the main effects of X.
Okay, main effects. Main effects how? Economically, socially, short-term effects, long-term. That feels way too broad.
Exactly. Without defining the scope of effects, the question is just too open-ended. It allows for totally unfocused answers. And then how do you even evaluate those answers consistently against a marking scheme?
Right, it becomes subjective.
Yeah, the report really stresses that terminology needs to be unambiguous, especially within the context of whatever subject you're testing.
And the report made a really critical point here about intentionality, didn't it? About whether the question actually gets at what it's supposed to be assessing.
Yes, absolutely. This is a core logical problem. Does the question actually prompt the specific thinking or pull out the specific information the writer intended it to? And the source gives this really powerful example. Imagine asking students to explain why X is superior to Y.
Okay.
But The question doesn't provide any established criteria for what superior actually means in that specific context.
Wow, okay. I never really thought about that. If you don't give me the criteria for superior, I kind of have to make them up myself, right?
Exactly.
Like, I might say X is superior because it's faster. Someone else might say Y is superior because it's cheaper or more reliable. We could both be right based on our own invented criteria.
And the report explains that's the flaw. It forces you, the student, to invent the standards for comparison. You're not being assessed on your understanding of X and Y based on, say, a framework you were taught in class.
No, you're being assessed on your ability to just invent a plausible framework on the fly.
Right. And that completely undermines the consistency, the validity of evaluating the answers. It's a major logical flaw because it totally changes what's being measured.
Okay, so a question can look fine grammatically, all the words make sense on their own, but the actual idea or the task it's setting up is fundamentally flawed. It's too vague, or it's missing crucial information, or it relies on hidden assumptions.
Absolutely. And that brings us to what might be the most crucial criterion, especially when we talk about that construct irrelevant variance thing again. Student addressability.
Student addressability, that sounds like it's about, well, can the student actually understand the question? Is it aimed right at them?
Precisely. It asks, is the question clear and comprehensible to the intended student population? Because think about it, a question could be grammatically perfect, totally logically sound, but still fail here if the students it's actually designed for can't easily process and understand what's being asked of them.
So what kinds of things make a question fail on addressability, even if it's technically correct?
Well, things like using overly technical jargon, especially if that jargon isn't really central to what students are supposed to be learning at that specific level.
Right.
Or remember that sentence complexity we talked about under linguistics? It's a huge factor here, too. Long, convoluted sentences with lots of clauses just drastically increase the cognitive load needed just to read the question.
Before you even get to the content.
Yeah, completely separate from thinking about the subject matter. Or using cultural references, maybe idioms that might not be universally understood by all the students taking the test, would introduce bias.
So it's really about how much mental energy the wording itself demands, completely separate from the energy needed to actually remember or apply the subject knowledge.
Exactly, and the report makes it clear. This is where that construct irrelevant variance becomes a really serious threat to fairness. Because dense phrasing, awkward sentence structures, maybe complex idiomatic expressions, these things can disproportionately affect certain students. Maybe students from different linguistic backgrounds, English language learners perhaps, or students with certain learning differences.
Even if they know the subject inside out, they get tripped up just by the way the question is written.
Yes. The report says this explicitly introduces that construct irrelevant variance again. You end up measuring their language processing skills or maybe their test-taking savvy and navigating tricky sentences.
Instead of their actual knowledge of the subject.
Right. And that's a fundamental threat to the assessment's fairness and its validity. It means the test isn't truly assessing what it claims to be assessing, at least not for everyone who takes it.
Wow. It's really striking how these different criteria, linguistic, logical, addressability, they all overlap, don't they? An issue in one area can totally sink a question's effectiveness.
Definitely. And when you look across a whole set of questions like this report did, you often start to see patterns, the same kinds of issues popping up again and again.
So it's not just like random one-off mistakes. It could point to more systemic problems in how the questions are being created.
Exactly right. If you see, for example, pronoun ambiguity showing up repeatedly, or maybe a consistent reliance on unstated assumptions across multiple questions, or frequent issues with a vocabulary level, that suggests deeper issues, maybe in the question design process itself, or perhaps in the guidance or training given to the people writing the questions.
And the report really stressed that these patterns, these systemic flaws, have much broader implications, right, for the whole assessment program, not just those individual questions.
Oh, absolutely they do.
Right.
Because recurrent systemic flaws undermine the overall validity of the assessment results, the reliability, the fairness.
Right.
If your questions are consistently compromised, then the data you get from them is also compromised. Think about it. What if every question testing, say cause and effect reasoning in history, used really complex sentences or had pronoun ambiguity?
Then the results might suggest students don't understand cause and effect.
When the real issue might be that they just couldn't reliably parse the questions asking about it. And that leads to bad decisions. Less defensible decisions about student progress, maybe about curriculum changes, resource allocation. It erodes trust in the whole assessment system.
That really brings it home. It's not just about one annoying, confusing question. It's about whether you can actually trust the big picture the assessment is painting. Okay, so the report found these problems, these patterns. What did it suggest doing about it? How do we move towards writing genuinely better questions?
Well, the report offered several pretty concrete, actionable recommendations. Yeah. Things aimed at improving the whole process, really from the start.
Okay, what were some of the key suggestions?
Well, a big one is enhancing the guidelines and the training for the people who actually write the questions.
Makes sense.
Explicitly teaching them how to spot and avoid these common pitfalls we've been talking about, like how to simplify complex sentences, how to ensure pronouns are clear, how to define potentially vague terms within the question itself.
So using the findings from reviews like this to directly inform the training.
Exactly. Especially training focused specifically on the types of issues that are found to be common. That can have a really direct positive impact.
Oh, else.
Another key thing is implementing more robust review processes. Multi-stage reviews.
Not just one person checking.
Right. Getting different kinds of expertise involved. Maybe peer review from other subject experts, but also review by language specialists, assessment experts, maybe even specific bias reviewers who are looking carefully for those addressability issues related to language or culture.
Like a team approach to catch these subtle but important flaws.
Yeah. And crucially, they also recommend prioritizing student addressability by actually involving the target population more.
Like trying questions out on actual students?
That's one way, yeah. Piloting questions with students and getting their direct feedback on clarity. Or, they suggest, encouraging reviewers to actively adopt a student persona.
A student persona.
Yeah, trying to consciously read the question as if you were a learner at that level, maybe encountering this specific phrasing or concept for the first time in this format.
I like that idea. Stepping outside your own expert knowledge for a minute and thinking, okay, would a 10th grader, maybe one who's great at science but finds complex reading a bit tricky, would they truly get what's being asked here without getting tangled up?
Exactly. And finally, the report really pushed for fostering a culture of continuous improvement. Meaning looking at the assessment data, which questions students struggled with most, alongside close look at the textual features of those questions themselves.
Connecting the dots.
Yeah. Go back to those difficult questions. Analyze their wording using these kinds of criteria. Was the difficulty truly about the underlying content, or was the question itself acting as a barrier?
This has been, wow, such an insightful deep dive. It honestly changes how you think about something as seemingly simple as just rating a question for a test.
It really does. It takes so much careful attention, not just to the subject matter itself, but to the language, the underlying logic, and maybe most importantly, how a student is actually going to process and understand it. Getting that right is just absolutely essential if you want assessment that's genuinely fair and accurate.
So maybe the next time you encounter an assessment question, whether you're taking it or writing it, just take a moment and consider this. How much of your mental effort is going into just parsing the language of that question?
Yeah.
How much does that decoding effort take away from the energy you actually need to answer it based on what you know? And think about how a question could be perfectly correct, grammatically speaking, logically sound on some level, but still fail completely because it isn't truly addressable to the person it's meant for. And maybe it ends up measuring their language skills or their test wiseness instead of their grasp of the actual topic.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, about how much the clarity, the construction of communication, whether it's in a test question or just everyday conversation, how much that impacts our ability to understand each other and respond effectively